Now, this webinar series is an expression of a number of features of the College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists of the Royal Society. It reflects the college's commitment to fostering engagement among its members and conscripting the tremendous insight and knowledge held by our members to shed light on pressing societal issues. It also demonstrates the strength that flows from the college's committedly interdisciplinary nature, showing what happens when we reach across disciplinary lines to reflect on issues of public moment. And really, this webinar is one of many activities, several activities of the college that reflect exactly those kinds of commitments. Specifically, though, this afternoon's webinar is entitled, "What is Canadian Secularism?" You've all read the description, but let me just provide a word or two by way of thematic introduction, and then I'll turn to the panel and we'll start the conversation. Really, this webinar's point of departure is the observation that we find ourselves collectively increasingly involved in public conversations about the role of religion in public life. This really has been a long discussion in Canada, but it's in part been energized in recent years by events, by legislation, including, friend of mine, the law on the laicity of the state in Quebec, which is very much in public conversation, is coming to the Supreme Court of Canada in the coming year, a law that we'll touch on a little bit more today during our conversations. But even that is just part really of a broader conversation about how we understand what feels like a volatile, an unstable political moment in which basic terms of liberal democracy seem at issue and seem unstable. And among those terms that feel this way, that are part of that instability or uncertainty, is, I think, the concept of secularism. It's invoked in many spaces by many people, and yet seems capable of holding very different meanings, depending on the moment, depending on who's speaking, depending on the context. This concept of secularism is also a subject that has been subject to significant scholarly reflection over the last really couple of decades. But the purpose of this webinar, just sort of briefly put, is to bring the fruit of those different disciplinary scholarly conversations about secularism, about its formation, about its nature, about its character, into contact with those public debates right now. The hope is to do what at our best we are to do as academics, which is to enrich, to complicate, to illuminate what might be at stake as these conversations carry on. And that's really the purpose of our time together today. So to do just that, we've brought together a wonderful interdisciplinary group for a conversation about the nature and meaning of secularism, including in Canada. And this is, I'll say, an area of my own research and scholarship. I'm also mindful that in assembling this wonderful panel, there were many other members of the college that would have interesting things to add to this conversation. But I am particularly delighted to have this group together. And as you'll see, we've decided to hold this more as a conversation, as a set of questions and conversation points rather than presentations. And so I just want to briefly introduce you to each of them. I'm going to introduce them and also ask them to say a word or two about their general work, about their discipline, and how they come at the sorts of questions that we'll be speaking about. And premièrement, David Cousins est professeur à la faculté de droit de l'Université de Sherbrooke, où il est titulaire de la chaire de recherche droit, religion et laïcité. Il est membre du collège. David.
Oui, merci Ben pour cette présentation. Et essentiellement, donc je travaille en tant que juriste et sociologue sur les enjeux de laïcité depuis une vingtaine d'années désormais, en observant quels sont les discours, les narratifs sur la laïcité qui circulent à la faveur de la francophonie, notamment en France, au Québec et en Belgique, des discours d'une forme de laïcité qu'on peut qualifier aujourd'hui de nationaliste, et pour essayer de comprendre comment ces discours vont ensuite trouver écho dans des droits nationaux, et cela même si ces droits nationaux n'étaient peut-être pas les plus prêts à les recevoir.
Ensuite, Alison Harrell est professeure de sciences politiques à l'UQAM et elle est aussi membre du Québec.
Et bonjour tout le monde. Vous avez dit, je suis en sciences politiques, mais je suis particulièrement spécialiste de l'opinion publique et je m'intéresse comment les relations intergroupes vont influencer les opinions envers les politiques publiques différentes, mais aussi les acteurs politiques différents, notamment les partis politiques.
Merci. And finally, Pamela Claassen is professor and chair in the Department of the Study for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And
thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this college meeting, Ben. So I'm in the study of religion, focused on North America, 19th and 20th centuries, and my work looks at religion and religious practices as they engage with other spheres of expertise and authority, including midwifery, medicine, law, most recently geology. I'm writing a book on public memory of gold rushes in Canada and New Zealand and Australia. My work has also focused on Indigenous settler relations in 19th and 20th centuries. I have an ongoing collaborative project on ancient burial mounds and earthworks called Mounds in Memory, which is a collaboration with artists, archaeologists, very interdisciplinary, and is also based in a long-term collaboration with Rainy River First Nations and their Kanachuanam Historical Center, which is in Treaty 3 territory in Western Ontario.
Wonderful. Welcome, and let's turn to the conversation. As I say, today's webinar is asking a specific question: what is Canadian secularism? And as I mentioned in the introduction, that question is conceptually very interesting, also prompted by certain current issues that are the subject of political, legal, public reflection. But before we even turn to those issues specifically, and before we turn to the Canadian case in particular, I want to just pause on the key term in the question that anchors the webinar, secularism. And I want to ask some questions of the three of you about that term, about that concept. And Pamela, I think I'll start with you and ask very broadly a challenging question. Is secularism a tradition? Is it an ideal? Is it a project? How would you define secularism?
Thank you. I definitely think that secularism is all three of those things. I think that David thinks so as well, which will be interesting. Definitely secularism is a tradition that has its own history, its own rituals, its own mantras, the separation of church and state being one of the biggest. It's also an ideal that people aspire to in one form. That would be not privileging one religion above another. That might be one aspect of the ideal of secularism. But it's also a political project that really, in some cases, wants to have a big role in shaping how society is organized, how people relate to each other, the kinds of power that the state may or may not have over people's bodies, or that religious organizations may or may not have over people's bodies, especially, I would say. And I think there have been a lot of scholars in this very interdisciplinary field of secularism studies that spend a lot of time defining what secularism is or is not, which I do think is a very important thing to do. I would consider myself as part of that group. But if I may, I might just turn to an early well, maybe it's not so early, but a definition by sociologist Jose Casanova, who distinguishes between secularization and secularism. I don't think it's the only definition, but I think it is a helpful starting point. And for him, the secular is a sort of epistemic category. It's a way that we think about life in the modern world. But then for Casanova, secularization is more of a process by which, a social, historical, political process by which religion gets carved out from other spheres of human activity and organization, whether it be politics, economics, other sorts of ways of defining how we organize ourselves as humans. And science would be one of the key ones, I think, for people in the Royal Society of College to think about the relationship between science and the secular is particularly interesting, I think. I think that process of secularization is much more messy than people often think. It's certainly not an achieved process, and it's not something that is necessarily only a kind of linear process. And then for Casanova, secularism is a kind of worldview or an ideology that is both as we can see in many cases, becomes a worldview that states can make use of to sort of organize and understand how religion fits into state power, but also can be much broader than the state and a concept that many people use to understand what it means to be modern. I think these definitions have been refined, contested in many different ways over the years, but I think they still remain, secularism still remains powerful as a tradition, an ideal, and a political project. And I would just say really briefly, it's important in our conversation to think a little bit about the importance of Christianity, particularly in shaping what has become secularism. So if the secular is a way of sort of hiving religion off from these other spheres, often that religion has been de facto Christianity, the one that has been kind of both sort of in power, in the powerful position, the privileged position in the context of separation of church and state. We can see it quite clearly there. Of course, many other religions are in play in the context of debates about secularism, which I'm sure we'll hear about. And that the secular has so many different meanings, including a geological one, which means very long periods of time over which the earth changes. So I think that the secular is a really rich term for us to think about it in an interdisciplinary way.
Thank you, and including in bringing in definitions that come from totally other domains that are not political. David, I want to invite you to add to that question about how you would define secularism, whether it's offering other definitions that you think are productive to think about, or building off of Pamela's. But let me also add another question. In our title for today, you see the singular, right? Secularism. Les spécialistes parlent parfois de secularisms. Existe-t-il plusieurs types de laïcité? Comment comprendre cela?
Oui, merci pour ces questions. D'abord, je voudrais donc rebondir sur une définition assez large, et je rejoins ce que Pamela a dit, à savoir que la laïcité peut à la fois être comprise comme un idéal, un projet politique, une tradition, mais essentiellement, on peut aussi référer aux travaux des sociologues et des juristes qui travaillent. Alors, il y a une production conséquente sur la laïcité depuis une trentaine d'années maintenant, et qui ont montré comment chacun, dans leurs contextes nationaux, des formes de laïcité avaient émergé. Et donc, pour montrer que finalement, la laïcité est une caractéristique intrinsèque de toutes les démocraties libérales, et non pas seulement de certains contextes nationaux auxquels on va systématiquement associer la laïcité. C'est-à-dire que il n'y a pas de démocratie libérale sans laïcité, il n'y a pas de laïcité sans démocratie libérale. Parce que tous les États, les démocraties libérales se sont construites à partir d'une forme d'émancipation, à partir d'églises, une émancipation d'églises qui voulait conserver une mainmise sur les choix moraux et politiques de la société. Et cette émancipation, c'est une forme de récupération d'une légitimité du peuple, une réappropriation de la souveraineté du peuple contre les églises. Et ça renvoie à quoi? À un principe de séparation des églises et de l'État, ou d'autonomisation du droit à l'égard de normativité religieuse. Et on l'observe dans toutes les démocraties libérales, avec en même temps un renforcement des États de droit, qui vont garantir de plus en plus largement l'égalité de tous les citoyens, quels que soient leurs choix moraux, leur conception de la vie bonne, et qui va garantir la liberté de conscience et de religion. Et donc, quand on voit ça, on voit que dans toutes les démocraties libérales, on a une forme de séparation qui émerge, une forme de neutralité à l'égard du religieux qui va émerger, pour garantir la liberté de religion, et la liberté de religion, quelles que soient les convictions religieuses. Et ces quatre principes émergent donc graduellement, de façon différente, et la façon dont il se déploie dans la gouvernance politique permet aujourd'hui de typifier des laïcités. Donc on va voir des laïcités qui vont être plus séparatistes, où on va mettre l'accent sur une forte séparation entre les églises et l'État. On va avoir des formes de laïcité qui vont être plus collaborationnistes, où le religieux a une place prépondérante dans la gouvernance politique. On va avoir des formes de laïcité très voltairiennes, anti-religieuses, où l'État se construit contre le religieux. Et finalement, on observe donc qu'il va y avoir des types de laïcité qui sont très différents selon les démocraties libérales, et que ces laïcités évoluent même au sein des démocraties libérales. Donc, dans un même contexte national, il n'y a pas une laïcité, il va y avoir plusieurs formes de laïcité selon le temps, selon le moment, la période, le contexte, comme le disait Ben tout à l'heure. Et je voudrais juste ajouter une petite chose en regard de ce que nous disait Pamela. Le christianisme, la chrétienté a probablement normalisé des façons de penser la laïcité. Mais la laïcité, étant propre aux démocraties libérales, n'est pas une spécificité d'État chrétien. Il ne faut pas oublier que la Turquie est un État qui a ancré la laïcité dans ses fondements constitutionnels dans les années 30. Le Japon, qui n'est pas un État qui va formaliser la laïcité dans sa constitution, formalise néanmoins un principe de séparation fort entre les églises et l'État. Et les sociologues japonais aujourd'hui travaillent sur les types de laïcité qui émergent au Japon. Et donc, ce sont aussi c'est un principe politique que l'on observe dans d'autres contextes que des contextes chrétiano-centrés.
Merci, and we'll talk more about what maybe we can take out of that enormous range of meanings, what we might attach to. And I hear, your core claim, which is this is a property of liberal democracy. More on that, but from that conceptual space, Alison, plus concrètement, lorsque nous regardons autour de nous dans différents pays, en particulier dans différentes démocraties libérales, quelles tensions observons-nous dans la manière dont les différents régimes politiques discutent de la signification de la laïcité?
Mais de mon côté, je trouve super fascinant ce que mes collègues sur le semestre à la table par l'instant ont mentionné, parce que je crois que c'est la diversité des définitions du terme qui est le fait qu'on peut l'utiliser dans les contextes de façon très stratégique, très utilitaire, et donc à travers les pays, il y a des institutions, des façons de le comprendre différentes. Certaines, c'est beaucoup plus cette neutralité entre l'État et les églises. D'autres, ça met beaucoup de l'emphase sur la liberté religieuse. Et cette balance peut être utilisée par les acteurs. Mais pour moi, ce qui est le plus intéressant, c'est de voir à travers ces contextes comment on peut l'utiliser pour remettre en question soit l'inclusion ou l'exclusion de certains groupes. Et je crois que c'est ce qui, pour moi, en tant que spécialiste de l'opinion publique, c'est ce qui est le plus intéressant, surtout étant donné ce que Pamela a dit à propos de cette tradition qui vise l'Église chrétienne, qui a un positionnement avantagé dans le contexte actuel, lié à cette tradition. Et donc, si on voit dans le contexte actuel, souvent c'est mobilisé par les acteurs politiques, des personnes différentes, pour essayer de comprendre pourquoi certaines dans les démocraties libérales sont à l'extérieur de ce qu'on considère comme des normes démocratiques, comme le sécularisme ou la laïcité plutôt. Donc, c'est ça qui m'intéresse le plus dans le contexte actuel, c'est comment ça peut être utilisé pour cadrer des enjeux, mais jamais de façon neutre, parce qu'on peut choisir quels aspects du laïcité on peut mobiliser dans un contexte particulier pour des fins politiques très particuliers, de débattre en positionnement plutôt que de débattre le contexte.
So it's exactly the range of meanings that open space for different political uses. and I'll ask you more about that as well. But for present purposes, I wonder, in the midst of all of that complexity, can we venture any sort of core meaning that we can agree to in respect of either what secularism means or what it seems to mean in popular usage? Perhaps the answer is we really can't. It's all about uses. Or maybe there is something that, from each of your perspectives, you think is worth holding as a core meaning as we carry on the conversation. So perhaps I'll come back to you, Pamela, to give a thought, and then David and Alison.
Well, you'll probably not be surprised that I'm not sure that we can hang on to one core meaning. I think what I would say is very much in common with what both of you have said is that meanings of secularism and the secular have changed over time in a great deal, and they're also profoundly local. So I think even what is the secular or laicity, which are different words, they're not just simple translations, but what is the secular in Toronto is actually quite different from what the secular is in Montreal, let alone in India or Turkey and Canada. I might also wonder, this is not answering your question, but there are also perhaps illiberal democracies in which secularism is a strategic tool as well. So I would love to hear what you think about that, but that's a different question. I also think that the word secular, can be it can be a rallying cry in so many different ways. It can be a legal term, but it can also be an insult. Like when a conservative Christian says someone is secular, that is just an insult. So there's I think it would be, as scholars of the secular, I'm not sure there's one thing we can hang on to, even though perhaps personally I might think that there are secular ideals that I too share, as someone who thinks a lot about questions of reproductive freedom or other kinds of issues.
I would argue that secularism in itself does not exist, because it's impossible to have a single definition of what secularism is, and it's impossible to consider that a state will adopt the best or the purest form of secularism as possible. La laïcité, on n'aura jamais de consensus sur ce qu'elle veut dire en soi. Il y a une pluralité de discours et donc de mise en place dans le droit et dans les politiques publiques de ce que sont les laïcités. Par contre, on peut s'accorder sur une chose. Il y a notamment une déclaration universelle sur la laïcité qui a été présentée en 2005, donc au moment du 100e anniversaire de la loi française de séparation des églises et de l'État, qui a été présentée par autour de 250 universitaires qui venaient d'une trentaine d'États différents et qui travaillaient tous sur la laïcité et qui finalement s'accordaient sur une question, sur deux points. Le premier, c'est de dire qu'il n'y a pas de définition de la laïcité. Mais par contre, la laïcité, on peut l'observer dans les contextes nationaux et la comprendre à travers ces 4 principes constitutifs. Comment on observe cette séparation entre les églises et de l'État? Comment l'État va à minima faire preuve de neutralité à l'égard du religieux, sachant que la neutralité pure n'existe pas non plus. Quel est le degré de liberté de religion qui va être accordé et dans quelle mesure on favorise l'égalité entre les conceptions de la vie bonne en mettant en œuvre cette liberté. Donc, c'est en observant comment empiriquement ces principes vont se déployer dans la gouvernance ou dans les discours qu'on va pouvoir, nous, chercheurs, déceler ou mettre en lumière des définitions différentes de la laïcité. Mais par contre, je pense que endosser a priori en amont une définition de la laïcité reviendrait à l'essentialiser et finalement à en perdre toute la richesse.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree on what David was saying about religious neutrality and the separation of church and state, and religious liberty, and those 3 component parts are really how we think about it, but they take many different forms. But I think if we think about how your average person thinks about what is secular, it is that which is not religious. Mm-hmm. And so if you just ask somebody in the street what secular is, it's that which is not religious. And so it comes with these sorts of values with it. And I think that's how it becomes operationalized for average people. It's a rejection of religion. in many ways, and then sometimes a very explicit rejection of religion that's either viewed as a good or a bad thing. But that, I think, is really important to just. There's some fantastic work in the US that thinks about how people think about secularism. And it's about that which is not religious, but also a rejection of religious dogma. And so the valorizing science, as you said in your opening remarks, and thinking about it as that which is not in the spiritual realm and that which we can observe and understand. And valuing that has all kinds of implications for how people engage in politics. People who have strong secular beliefs tend to participate more, just like people with strong religious beliefs tend to participate more than those who are simply not religious. It's an active rejection of religion.
And let me ask you something more about that. But before that, it's an interesting other feature of the conversations we're having, because the distance between people's certainty when they invoke the term at the level of popular understanding or sometimes political action, and what we're hearing about the instability of the term is vast. And so we have this huge gap between what a historical and kind of conceptual look at the term yields, and it's a very broad, highly variable thing, and then very tangible, concrete things that people mean when they're saying it. And that chasm seems to be part of the feature of the moment we're at. And I will just add a bit to the complexity. There is at least one scholar, and I'm thinking here of a Grama, who thinks that, well, secularism doesn't exist, but there is a question space, and he uses the language. Secularism is a question space, right? It's an area in which the place of religion in public life is salient, right? The question about what is the place is salient. That's the gesture to the space of the secular, and so I think that's interesting. But let's come back to this, kind of spend a touch more time on secularism as a category before we start to land in the particular. But we've talked about it conceptually, and Alison, you've been pointing to your preference to look at it in action as used. And so I want to stay with you, and feel free to start adding Canadian content, specificity if you like. We'll turn to Canada soon, you don't have to. But could you just say a bit more, Alison, about what some of these uses of secularism as a political tool actually look like? Can you speak a little bit more about how it is used as a concept, not just its possible meanings?
So I think in political framing, what we often see is appeals to religious freedom as one use of it in the public sphere, as well as how the state needs to be positioned in relationship to religious institutions. And I think that's what we've heard over and over again. Donc, dans le contexte de son utilisation, on a plein d'exemples dans le contexte québécois de l'utilisation d'un État laïque, une laïcité, comme un projet politique qui va mettre en question les valeurs de la société vis-à-vis de l'État et des citoyens et citoyennes, ainsi que les personnes sans statut de citoyenneté dans le contexte québécois. Et donc, je crois que ce qu'on voit dans ce contexte, c'est des principes fondamentaux dont les gens vont qualifier la société, mais aussi des projets politiques qui visent à exclure certaines également, notamment dans les discussions de la porte des signes religieuses dans la vie publique, et des fois pas si public que ça, dans des contextes différents dans l'espace public. Et donc, ici, on peut voir des mouvements différents, notamment, c'est un enjeu dans lequel je travaille un peu, comment les enjeux féministes, par exemple, vont être confrontés à la liberté religieuse et la laïcité, et comment on peut jouer avec les deux normes, les deux valeurs québécoises, pour être pour ou contre les droits qu'on va en discuter tantôt. Et donc, cette utilisation, c'est ce qui me semble très pertinent dans le contexte actuel, parce qu'il faut savoir pas juste ce que ça veut dire dans ce contexte, mais comment c'est utilisé pour promouvoir un positionnement face à des enjeux contemporains.
A specific question about its uses, perhaps, then, for David. David, dans certains pays, nous constatons que le principe de la laïcité, qui incarne depuis longtemps les valeurs et les principes de la gauche politique, est désormais repris et défendu par les partis de droite et d'extrême droite. Comment comprendre ce phénomène?
Oui, absolument. La laïcité est un principe qui était initialement défendu donc par les partis de gauche et sur les domaines les plus traditionnels sur lesquels finalement se sont construits les projets laïques, et notamment sur la question scolaire, la question de la laïcisation de l'école, mais aussi la question du financement des églises et des groupes religieux. Sur la question scolaire, donc on l'a vu très fortement dans certains contextes nationaux, comme au Mexique, par exemple, en France, en Belgique ou au Québec, où la laïcisation a vraiment été portée par des milieux qui étaient beaucoup plus à gauche. Aujourd'hui, la situation a changé. Et elle a changé sur deux terrains différents. Le premier terrain, c'est le fait que dans certains États, donc il y a eu une systématisation de l'immigration par points, comme au Canada, qui a favorisé une immigration originaire du Maghreb, francophone, au Québec par exemple. En France, il y avait une immigration musulmane qui était déjà établie depuis un peu plus longtemps. Et la visibilité des expressions religieuses des personnes musulmanes a été progressivement donc construite en tant que problème public par les groupes des partis politiques de droite. Certains, en France par exemple, appelaient dès 2003, donc c'était un parti qui s'appelait l'Union pour un mouvement populaire, qui était le parti de droite, appelé à une nouvelle laïcité contre cette ancienne laïcité de gauche et qui était plus ouverte à certaines expressions du religieux. Et donc aujourd'hui, les partis populistes se sont emparés de cette laïcité pour, d'une part, donc invisibiliser des expressions du religieux qui ne sont pas normalisées dans la culture de la société et auxquelles on va prêter des valeurs supposément incompatibles avec les valeurs de la majorité, et dans un autre temps pour revaloriser des symboles de la majorité, mais des symboles de la majorité qui seraient en voie de déclassement. Et notamment, il s'agit de tout l'héritage chrétien, les symboles du christianisme, mais auxquels on va retirer dans le discours public toute qualification religieuse pour les patrimonialiser et considérer finalement que leur présence dans l'espace public n'est somme toute pas une atteinte à la neutralité de l'État. Donc ça, c'est le premier aspect, peut-être la question de la visibilité du religieux, et donc invisibilisation du religieux des minorités, revalorisation du religieux des symboles de la majorité. Le deuxième aspect, et qui fait que les partis de droite s'emparent aussi de la question de la laïcité, c'est la question de l'autonomie du droit à l'égard des normativités religieuses, sur des questions sociétales, sur les questions d'avortement, par exemple, de mariage entre conjoints de même sexe, d'aide médicale à mourir. La situation est frappante en ce moment. Par exemple, en France, qui est en train de débattre à l'Assemblée nationale de la question de l'euthanasie. Les partis politiques de droite, mais aussi les églises, se sont donc levés contre ce projet qui est un projet d'émancipation à l'égard de normativités religieuses. On le voit fortement dans des contextes comme l'Amérique latine aujourd'hui, où les partis de droite populistes sont en train et donc appuyés par des mouvements évangélistes et catholiques conservateurs, sont en train de se lever pour contester les avancées sociétales sur les questions de droits sexuels et reproductifs. Donc oui, aujourd'hui, on voit que finalement, on a eu des laïcités libérales en appui de démocratie libérale, et au fur et à mesure que les démocraties deviennent de plus en plus illibérales, on a des nouvelles formes de laïcité illibérales aussi qui sont en train d'émerger, portées par ces projets populistes.
Well, very interesting and a wonderful kind of scan of current uses. I think Pamela, as our historian, our principal historian, I suppose, I wonder if you can help us with some of the history of its uses, at least. We're talking about the uses of the concept. Could you perhaps in particular reflect on the uses of both religion and secularism in colonial nation-making projects, like in Canada? In particular, how have commitments to secularism shaped Canadian approaches to Indigenous sovereignty and spirituality historically, but also today?
I think that you may not find the concept of secularism as secularism in these historical contexts, but I will attempt an answer to your question by starting with thinking about treaties and what some people think of as the colonial secular, even if it wasn't necessarily the term used at the time. So treaties between the Crown and Indigenous nations are one of the most important sites of Canadian nation making. There is no legitimate Canada without treaties that had been negotiated and agreed to with Indigenous nations. And a treaty, ideally, when it's kept, is committing the people who sign it, but also their future generations to honoring the promises that were made by their ancestors. And so since the earliest commitments that were made in Turtle Island between Indigenous peoples and the British Crown, treaty makers the treaties have not been mere pieces of paper. They are also ceremonies that are agreed to in council, with sharing a pipe, perhaps, through various kinds of ceremonies that make the promise real, materialize the promise. Treaty medals being one of the ways that treaties have been sort of materialized. But also in negotiating treaties, gods, spirits are invoked on both sides, and kings and queens are still in the British context, head of state and head of the church, and are religious have Christian power to them as well. So thinking about reminding us that treaties, yes, they're historical, but they're also alive today is one way to think about how religion is sort of at play in the Canadian nation-making process. I think we can all probably agree that Canada and Canadians have not adequately remembered or kept their promises that were made in the context of treaty making. And I actually think this is partly not necessarily a direct result, but it's definitely related to the rise of the idea of the secular and the religious sort of distinguishing themselves, but then also making certain kinds of ceremonial practice not even religious. So since Indigenous people in 19th and 20th centuries were regularly called, and these are derogatory words, I warn you, savage, superstitious, heathen, including by many people who were part of the Royal Society of Canada and wrote these things in the proceedings of the Royal Society of Canada. I'll say more about that later. So in the context of Canada and the United States, when the secular politics largely arose in battles between where people wanted to separate the powers of the church and the state, or the powers of the people, as you said earlier, they come to define the religious opposed to the secular through largely a Christian lens, as I said earlier. So self-declared atheists, secularists, some of whom might have actually still been Christian, because the line between an atheist can still be Christian historically. They saw themselves as involved in a battle that was dealing with all kinds of different questions, whether it was around education, the role of the church in education, land tenure, women's reproductive rights, etc. And they embraced the separation of church and state. But I have argued, and others have argued, that the explicit goal of separating church and state often also had the effect of giving kind of latent power to Christianity as the template for what counts as religion. And so then in the process of that, colonial secular ways of constituting the nation of Canada privileged Christianity, even in the process of separating it from the state, and effectively pushed Indigenous spirituality, ceremony, and sovereignty, because those things are all connected, into this realm of superstition, heathenism, many other words. And so the piling up of laws that made Canada into a nation were also often laws that were affecting this distinction between church and state, but also affecting a heathenization of Indigenous people. And the Indian Act has a huge role to play in this, as do residential schools and other you could see the residential school system as a Canadian nation-making project in itself, which is a bigger question. I know. So I think one of the very notion of the separation of church and state in some ways has actually enabled settler colonial nations to forget their treaty making and to forget their treaty promises, while also forgetting sort of Christian underpinnings to their sovereignty and to those treaty promises. So the fact that the king is coming next week to read the speech from the throne, I think we should all pay attention to what kinds of rituals and ceremonies come along with this. Often when the king or the queen or royal family members come to Canada, there are many Indigenous symbols deployed in various kinds of ways. Indigenous people are often part of that conversation. So it'll be interesting to see how his return to read the speech from, or his return, well, yeah, because it's a return. What might that actually say about the role of the secular, about the role of Canada, and about the role of Indigenous sovereignty in the continued making of Canada?
Well, you've drawn us, all three of you, but Pamela most immediately into Canadian specificity. So let's kind of turn into that. I think we're prepared to get to this question. That is the title of our webinar, What is Canadian Secularism? And of course, that's a question that's interesting for a number of reasons. Just based on our conversation so far, it's interesting because it captures a set of the uses, as Alison has emphasized. It reflects many of the principles in contestation that David has brought our attention to, and it carries forward the history that Pamela has begun to explore for us. But it's also interesting, of course, because it's shaped by current debates, and we come back in our minds to this case going to the Supreme Court of Canada around Quebec's law on the laicity of the state. And as Alison suggested in one of her answers, that law asserts that in pursuit of a number of principles, including laicite and gender equality, the Quebec government must, the law says, regulate the appearance of religious symbols in public spaces in a variety of ways, chiefly through the wearing of attire described as religious by wearing by public officials, attire that is coded as or described as religious in various sorts of ways. So we definitely need to understand this law, what it's doing, why it's so contentious a little bit more. That's very much in the background of our conversation. But as we get going on the Canadian situation, let's begin directly with this question we've posed ourselves, keeping in mind throughout all of these complexities of the term that we've been looking at. And to David, I might ask, in one sense, secularism is often most immediately associated with certain states like Turkey and France, and we're now in public conversation because of this law. But not only because of this law, now becoming increasingly accustomed to using this term, a secular state, in a Canadian setting, in this place. But we're not quite as used to hearing it associated with Canada at large. So we're becoming used to it being used in respect of Quebec, maybe not quite as used to hearing it described in respect of Canada at large. So I suppose my question to you is, does the question, what is Canadian secularism, in light of everything we've been saying so far, make sense? Right? Is there a Canadian secularism? Maybe you can take us into that question first.
Oui, alors est-ce qu'il y a une laïcité canadienne ou est-ce qu'il y a des laïcités canadiennes? Mais je voudrais faire un petit détour quand même avant d'arriver vraiment à la question. Quand on parle de laïcité, on va penser à la France, qui a inscrit le principe de laïcité dans sa constitution, à la Turquie, qui a inscrit le principe de laïcité dans sa constitution, aujourd'hui au Québec, qui a inscrit le principe de laïcité dans un texte législatif. Mais ce n'est pas parce que le mot laïcité, secularism est inscrit dans le dispositif juridique que la laïcité émerge réellement dans la gouvernance politique. Si on réfléchit ne serait-ce qu'à la Turquie, Dans quelle mesure peut-on dire aujourd'hui que la Turquie laïque constitutionnellement connaît un vrai régime de séparation de l'État et des églises, garantit réellement la liberté de religion, et la liberté de religion pour tous, y compris les minorités religieuses, ce qui impliquerait une forme de neutralité de l'État. C'est pas le cas. Donc, laïcité sur le plan du texte juridique constitutionnel, mais empiriquement, on ne voit pas cette laïcité dans la gouvernance politique. Donc, ici, je pense qu'il faut vraiment transposer ce type de raisonnement quand on réfléchit au Québec et au Canada. Le gouvernement québécois adopte une loi en 2019 et une loi en 2019 qui fait que le ministre qui la porte à l'époque nous dit on a fait la laïcité au Québec. Mais on n'a pas fait la laïcité au Québec. Le Québec était déjà laïque à peu près à tous les égards, même si la laïcité pure, parfaite, n'existe pas. La séparation parfaite et étanche avec le religieux n'est pas possible. La neutralité absolue n'existe pas. Il y a toujours des limitations à la liberté. Mais donc, ce n'est pas la loi qui a fait la laïcité. Empiriquement, elle existait. Et donc, à contrario, un État qui n'a pas affirmé la laïcité dans son dispositif peut très bien en appliquer tous les principes constitutifs, peut très bien être séparé à minima, peut très bien garantir la liberté de religion, peut très bien être neutre au regard des expressions religieuses. Et c'est le cas du reste du Canada. Le Canada est un État qui garantit la liberté de conscience et de religion. À l'article 2A de la charte, et à travers toute une jurisprudence qui a été élaborée depuis les années 80, plutôt qui a été perfectionnée depuis les années 80 par la Cour suprême du Canada. Le Canada est un État qui est à minima séparé des églises. Les églises ne déterminent pas la façon de vivre en société aujourd'hui au Canada, même si dans certaines provinces, dans la plupart des provinces, le système d'éducation, et c'est une exception constitutionnelle, mais demeure encore organisé sur un régime confessionnel. Donc, on a une forme de laïcité qui est très présente au Canada. Le Canada est très clairement un État laïque, même s'il ne l'affirme pas comme tel, et un État dans lequel on a plusieurs régimes de laïcité. Alors, je vais reprendre un exemple qui est tiré peut-être de la France. La France, c'est un État qui a un régime de droit commun de séparation des églises, mais qui connaît néanmoins près de 8 régimes différents de relations avec les États. C'est-à-dire que dans plusieurs parties du territoire français, l'État reconnaît des églises en particulier, les finance, et les membres du clergé sont des fonctionnaires de l'État. C'est le cas notamment en Alsace-Moselle, mais c'est le cas également en Outre-mer, avec des régimes différents selon les régions où on se situe. Si on transpose à nouveau et qu'on revient au Canada, l'éducation est une compétence provinciale. Et donc, on va avoir une forme de laïcité ou de séparation sur le plan de l'éducation qui ne va pas être la même en Ontario qu'au Québec ou qu'au Nouveau-Brunswick. Et donc, on a une polymorphie spatiale de la laïcité qu'on observe au Canada, comme on peut l'observer en France, ce qui nous revient à dire à nouveau que la laïcité pure n'existe pas, la laïcité en soi n'existe pas. Il y a différents modes d'arrangement de la laïcité qui évoluent dans le temps, dans l'espace, selon le problème social face auquel on va être confronté. Et donc, en conclusion, le Canada connaît très certainement un régime, des régimes de laïcité, mais sur lesquels les chercheurs, nous, on a encore beaucoup à se pencher, ne serait-ce que pour déconstruire une idée qui est véhiculée très régulièrement aussi dans le Canada anglais, selon laquelle la laïcité, ce serait le Québec. Et donc, la laïcité, ce serait l'anti-religion, ce serait la limite à la liberté, ce qui n'est pas ça. C'est une forme de laïcité plus illibérale, plus attentatoire à la liberté, qui a émergé dans un contexte donné, mais ça n'est pas la laïcité.
And as you say, it leaves that question of how we normatively evaluate the different schemes is a different question than identifying that there are multiple arrangements. Pamela, from your stance in religious studies, how do you regard that question? And maybe you could talk about the sources of Canadian secularism, even the role that scholars and academics have played in whatever this Canadian secularisms might be?
I'm not sure I'm going to give you my religious studies angle, but it is definitely. I mean, I think religious studies is very interdisciplinary. We take all comers. I think Canadian secularism is definitely something that has emerged through academic conversations, and I think it's. I went to McGill University many decades ago and studied with Charles Taylor, and I think he's. Most people will likely know he's probably the biggest voice in terms of giving a kind of prominence to the secular as both a concept and also as something that is at play in the world. So he's probably given been the biggest academic voice in the making of secularism both as an ideal, as a tradition, as a political project. To go back to what we were talking about earlier. So many of you probably know he wrote a very large book called The Secular Age in 2007. And he argues that the secular arises once religion becomes a choice for people. This is one of it's a very long book, so there's many arguments as part of it. One of the big ones that people take away is that with the disenchantment of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, people start to see that it's a choice to become part of a religion or not. And so then that is a secular frame. He calls it the immanent frame. And without worrying about like the fears about what gods or spirits are going to do to you based on your behavior, the secular becomes not just the absence of religion, but also a site for a kind of moral subject in and of itself. So that's where the secular becomes a kind of tradition as well. He also uses the language of secular being a social imaginary, collective storytelling, collective narratives, many different kinds of things. So it's a very rich understanding of the secular. But I think what's so interesting about Taylor is that he was not just a political theorist or a philosopher writing these very large books that many people read, impressively, but he was also a public servant who really thought about the secular in many different ways. And in fact, I don't know what you think about this or what you think about this, being located right here in Quebec, but the year after he publishes the Secular Age, he also is the co-author with many people of what becomes colloquially known as the Bouchard-Taylor Report on Reasonable Accommodation in the context of Quebec, which is based on many, many hours of listening to people talk about what they think about laicity and reasonable accommodation and religion in the public sphere. And so I think in complicated and perhaps largely unintended ways, this report becomes the ground for like the ur-text for what we are seeing now in the context of Quebec. And I actually regularly teach this report to my students because I think it is really a very interesting distillation of Charles Taylor's and others, academic intellectual ideas about the secular, but also thinking about secularism as a living tradition that requires critique, and that in the view of the report is probably best dealt with not through legal means, but through communities talking with each other and people talking with each other outside of legal context. So I would say that's what I would put forward as a really important distillation of Canadian secularism.
We're in a sense living the echo of that report in many ways today. And so, Alison, to bring a political science perspective, can you tell us anything about what we know about Canadians' attitudes towards secularism? Is it a principle Canadian support? Do they understand it as embodying different ideals or doing different work?
So I think in what you see in public opinion research, and I think this echoes what David has said as well, that's true. There's a discussion about laicity in Quebec right now. And so that term has political salience and people know what it means. And so you get public opinion data about people's attitudes towards laicity that suggests that there's very high levels of support in principle for this. Outside of Quebec, you don't see a lot of salience of the term secularism. I couldn't find survey research specifically about secularism as a concept. It's just not used in how people talk about the separation of church and state. That being said, there's lots of support for the principles that we're associating with secularism. So separation of church and state, religious freedom, state neutrality, all of those things not surprisingly, are very heavily supported in principle. But what you often see with those sorts of high levels of support, you see with most liberal democratic values. In principle, people think they're great. But it's when you put them in application, like in the Bouchard-Taylor report, where you actually have to make decisions about it applying to particular people from particular backgrounds, that's where you see a lot more variation in the application of secular principles to specific groups. And so there's survey research that asks about things like wearing religious symbols or manipulates pictures of people wearing different types of religious symbols that are associated with different religious traditions. And you see people make very distinct reactions based on the religion rather than the principle. And so you get two types of people in public opinion, some who are principled secularists. They think religion should be out of public life, and they will apply this principle equally across religions. And then you have another group that is using secularism to deny rights to specific groups. And so that principled practice is where you see, I guess, what I've been trying to say from the whole time. I think there are principled secularists, but it's often also used to deny rights when applied to specific groups. And so you can kind of see that distinction in Canadian public opinion when you do this sort of experimental work in Quebec as well as outside of Quebec. And it's not unique to Canada, obviously. You can get these same sorts of discriminatory applications of principles, particularly towards Muslim communities, when you start varying the types of religious symbols that people think of when they're trying to apply principles of secularism in practice.
That's interesting. Other way in, a methodological and disciplinary different pathway into points that David, as a legal scholar and theorist, made using other sort of analysis, different types of ways that secularism ends up being used. David, to ask you just a little bit further about the Canadian situation and how you, from where you sit and with your expertise, view secularism in Canada. In one sense, if we just follow the law in Quebec, the law on the state, it can seem like the issue of wearing symbols or issue of religious symbols is the key issue of secularism in Canada. Is it? What are the major issues actually surrounding secularism in Canada from your perspective?
Alors, on a l'impression que c'est l'enjeu majeur au Canada, mais pas qu'au Canada. Et on l'observe finalement dans toute la francophonie, et principalement depuis le début des années 2000. Donc, après l'attaque du 11 septembre, et puis au moment où des premières controverses vont vraiment éclater sur la visibilité des symboles du religieux. Et puis, c'est intéressant de l'observer parce que finalement, les choses commencent en France en 2003, 2004, et très rapidement, elles vont arriver en Belgique à la même époque, elles vont arriver en Suisse, elles arrivent au Québec en 2006 avec l'affaire Moultani, donc qui était l'affaire Moultani, c'est une décision de la Cour suprême par laquelle la Cour validait l'accommodement raisonnable qui avait été consenti à un jeune sikh et qui lui permettait de porter son kirpan rituel dans une école publique, qui était on validait un accommodement particulier consenti à une personne, mais ça a été très mal reçu dans la population et c'est ce qui a donné lieu à la création de la commission Bouchard-Taylor et à la production du rapport qu'évoquait Pamela. Donc en fait, la question est plus large que le Canada, mais ce qui est intéressant ici, c'est de voir qu'elle participe d'une réduction de la notion de la laïcité, et à laquelle le gouvernement québécois a fortement collaboré. Le titre de la loi, c'est « Loi sur la laïcité de l'État ». Donc on pourrait s'attendre à quelque chose d'envergure, c'est-à-dire une loi qui régule l'éducation, qui régule le financement des églises, qui s'applique bien plus largement à des questions de laïcité. Mais elle fait quoi? Elle porte sur le port de symboles religieux, uniquement. Et le port de symboles religieux pour certaines catégories de fonctionnaires provinciaux. Donc on a une réduction de la notion, et une réduction de la notion qui finalement fait qu'aujourd'hui on va associer, alors dans les sondages, c'est aussi des choses qu'on voit, la laïcité, on l'associe donc au port de symboles religieux et à l'islam. Parce que qui porte les symboles religieux, donc ce sont aujourd'hui principalement des personnes musulmanes. Donc une réduction, mais la laïcité, on ne peut pas la réduire à ça. Donc nous, en tant que chercheurs aussi, on doit sortir de la façon dont le politique détermine les termes du débat. Depuis 20 ans, les différents gouvernements ont façonné les contours de la discussion politique, et nous, il faut qu'on soit capable de sortir de ça pour montrer que, précisément, la laïcité ne peut être cantonnée à cette vision très réductrice. Alors, quels sont les enjeux laïques aujourd'hui au Canada? Il y en a énormément, et sur tous les fronts. Tout à l'heure, j'évoquais notamment la question des grandes avancées sociétales en matière de droits des minorités sexuelles et de genre. Ici, il ne faut pas oublier que la laïcité, elle se joue là où ça se voit, mais elle se joue là aussi où ça ne se voit pas, où il y a des groupes religieux qui vont être plus invisibles et qui vont être néanmoins très actifs, qui peuvent être associés à des partis aussi conservateurs à droite, et avoir comme agenda à terme de porter des coups de butoir dans des droits qui ont été acquis par les femmes, par les minorités sexuelles et de genre. Et on le voit très clairement aujourd'hui. Et donc, je pense qu'il faut aussi faire attention à ne pas détourner le regard et ne pas finalement être happé par la façon dont un gouvernement ou des gouvernements populistes aujourd'hui déterminent des termes très restrictifs au débat et finalement nous empêchent de voir là où les vrais enjeux d'autres enjeux de laïcité sont aussi importants.
And we might add, funding of education remains a very salient issue in Ontario and elsewhere.
Si je peux juste compléter ce qui est assez intéressant, par exemple, au Québec, c'est que dans le débat, la question du financement des écoles privées religieuses et la question du régime fiscal avantageux dont avoir les sociétés religieuses n'est absolument pas abordée. Alors que on aurait ici des questions de séparation qui seraient tout à fait légitimes à poser et qui ne sont pas. Donc on voit qu'on a aussi une volonté politique de diriger sur des enjeux qui peut-être politiquement sont électoralement sont gagnants.
And with Pamela's framing, maybe reconciliation too is properly thought of as an issue of this character. And so let me just ask you, Pamela, as well. What do you see from where you sit as the major issues surrounding secularism in Canada today?
I think I largely agree with my colleagues, Alison and Debbie. Also, just to note that the question around education and religious funding is alive and well south of the border as well, which we know. So I think, we need to acknowledge that secularism is a tradition. It's an ideal. It does not have a settled meaning. If we want to understand its power and possibility today, I think we need to grapple with its history. And we need to think about the ways that it is a shared tradition that has worked for gender equality, for religious freedom, not ironically, perhaps ironically, reproductive freedom, all these other kinds of things that I think are important to many people. We also need to think, understand, and remember when it has been wielded as a tool of exclusion, as a strategic tool, as Alison mentioned, especially against Muslim women in many contexts, also in terms of the diminishment of Indigenous ceremony and sovereignty. If people want secularism to be part of a living tradition that's part of a convivial society, we also have to be alert to the way that it can erase and demonize, but also alert to the way that it's fragile. It's not necessarily something that is just, we can't take it for granted. So I think it's an interesting conversation to be having right now.
Absolutely. And so we're having it. And so
yes, we are.
And maybe before moving to just our final part of our webinar, we have about 10 minutes left, and I have one set of questions that are specific to us as scholars in the RSC. But before I turn to that, Alison, I wonder, to return to your kind of theme of the political uses of secularism being the focus of your attention, What do you see at work here in the law that we keep touching on here in Quebec on the laicité de state?
Mais je ne sais pas si je peux mieux répondre que David, parce que je crois qu'il a vraiment pointé le droit sur cette utilisation très restrictive de ce que c'est la laïcité dans un contexte très particulier. Donc, je crois, je sais pas si je peux ajouter plein de choses à ça, mais ce que j'ai trouvé dans la conversation qu'on vient d'avoir sur cette thématique et ce que Pamela a dit, que la laïcité, ça semble comme une évolution dans l'attente de protéger les valeurs démocratique, mais c'est fragile et on peut utiliser ces mêmes types de valeurs démocratiques pour stratégiquement imposer la moralité différente des différentes religions, des différentes perspectives. Et c'est cette utilisation qui me semble super intéressante parce que on a déjà mentionné dans le contexte américain la laïcité dans ce contexte est souvent utilisée pour restreindre des droits de certaines en utilisant la liberté de religion comme justification. Et donc, je crois que cette dialectique entre le progrès vers l'inclusion et l'exclusion est fondamentale si on va comprendre cette loi-là, mais aussi comment ça va être utilisé à l'avenir dans les discussions qu'on va avoir.
So, given the occasion of this conversation, and again, our purpose in this webinar to complicate, to add texture and history and breadth to the conversation. We are having this webinar as part of a College of the Royal Society of Canada meeting. And I want the last portion of our conversation to be about the relationship between the academy, scholarship, and secularism. And I want to begin here with Pamela. And you sort of alluded to it at a couple of points. I think people might be surprised to learn about a relationship between the Royal Society and the history of secularism in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit of that story?
This is one version of that story. So the Royal Society gets founded in 1882. One of its charter members was Daniel Wilson, who later became the president in 1885, so just 3 years later. He was born in Scotland. He was a painter. He was an antiquarian who studied like ancient Scotland. Did not have a PhD or anything, but didn't stop him being invited to become the professor of history at the newly founded University College in the University of Toronto. And University College still understands itself as the first secular and non-sectarian college in Canada. So that's because they did not require people to write religious tests or to give religious tests to say, yes, I believe in this particular creed of this Christian church to be a member, to teach at the college. Mm-hmm. So that's what made it secular at that point. So for the most part, though, in the 19th century, most of the students were Protestant and male. In fact, Daniel Wilson was very against co-education and tried to keep women out, but he did not win that battle. So he's president of University College from 1880 to 1890, the president of the University of Toronto from 1890 to 1892, and he was a very fierce defender of the non-sectarian university. I will not go into it more, but in one quote, he is said to have said that secular education, pure and simple, is the better, more excellent way. So he really did dig deep into this sort of the secular as the way to form young people into to scholars and citizens. He's still today also considered, sometimes called one of the fathers of Canadian anthropology. There are many fathers of Canadian anthropology. I have not come across many mothers of Canadian anthropology in their writing, but that I know that there are some. And his most renowned book was called Prehistoric Man, Researchers into the Origins of Civilization in the Old World and New. So he liked to compare Scotland to Canada and North America, Indigenous people, actually many different places, and that's first published in 1862. And it's largely based on the readings of other anthropologists. He didn't do a lot of his own archaeological work, but he did do some, and he often depended on people like farmers, avocational archaeologists who were digging in their fields. And much of the collections that he gathered into a museum at the University College were those belongings were, and this is troubling, so I just alert you to that, were taken from Indigenous burial grounds, both ancient and more recent burial grounds, and he was critiqued for it in his day. Like, this is not something that people weren't worried about at the time. So a lot of that archaeological work of Wilson and others was based on the desecration of ancient and recent burial grounds around the Great Lakes. And he was very particularly focused on, and this is also troubling, so I just alert you to that, collecting crania or skulls. So he had a lot of human remains at the collection at University College, which the University College had a large fire in 1890. Many of these things disappeared. So he gave a lot of addresses to the Royal Society of Canada in his role, and many of them discuss that archaeological work. And if you go back and read them, I think they are sources for thinking about the secular, but also for thinking about the history of the Royal Society of Canada in really important ways. And I highly recommend this book, Royally Wronged, as one way into thinking about that history. So, and I think we think about the history of the Royal Society not because we want to just sort of trash the people in the past, but we want to actually think about what it means for today and what it meant in the past, and also what it means for us today. So,
thank you for that, and very important reminder of the ongoing relationship we might have with secularism, and certainly do have with those particular issues. And to push that forward a bit, David, if I can ask you, à une époque de montée des populismes et des attentes à l'état de droit, quel rôle peut jouer la Société royale du Canada sur les questions qui concernent la laïcité de l'État, tant dans la société qu'auprès des responsables politiques?
Je pense que l'exercice qu'on vient de faire aujourd'hui est une contribution et un rôle important que peut avoir la Société royale du Canada, qui permet notamment de comprendre que il y a une vraie diversité de façons de comprendre la laïcité, de conception de la laïcité, qui sont présentes donc dans l'espace public, et qui finalement ont toute une forme de légitimité aussi, et que nous, en tant que chercheurs, on doit essayer de diagnostiquer, de comprendre pour justement faire avancer le savoir, et puis ne pas se laisser enfermer dans la façon dont je le disais tout à l'heure. Des gouvernements vont tenter de manipuler cette notion. Il y a d'ailleurs des chercheurs qui ont même écrit plusieurs ouvrages. Je pense à Jean Bobéro, qui est spécialiste de la laïcité en France, pour montrer à quel point la laïcité était aujourd'hui falsifiée dans les discours, certains discours politiques. Falsifiés peut-être, mais en attendant, on a des conceptions qui sont présentes et que nous, on doit travailler. C'est important aussi de le faire de façon à pas rompre la conversation, la discussion démocratique à un moment de polarisation des positions. Et donc, je pense que l'exercice à nouveau qu'on fait aujourd'hui permet donc de donner une voix à différentes conceptions qu'il peut y avoir sur la laïcité. Une dernière chose, enfin, que je voudrais dire, c'est que dans cette période de montée des populismes, je pense que il faut aussi qu'on soit capable de rappeler aux origines libérales de la laïcité, donc de laïcité qui ont été initialement mises en œuvre pour garantir les libertés, garantir les libertés contre l'arbitraire de l'État, contre les prétentions de religion majoritaire dominante. Et donc, je pense que c'est important de revenir aussi aux origines libérales de ces laïcités, de les rappeler, de déconstruire des discours dominants et de le faire à la fois en rappelant le politique à ses obligations, en espérant qu'il puisse l'entendre et en participant au débat public plus largement.
Thank you. Wonderful analysis. And maybe you have some reflections as well on what role academics, good scholarship can play in informing these public debates.
Je crois que je reviendrai à la question de pratique et principe et application, parce que je crois qu'on a plein de choses à dire sur les principes, la complexité, comment on va la comprendre et comment ça se traduit dans le discours public. Et on est partie prenante dans ces discussions, on peut essayer de les informer. Mais de mon côté, en tant que politologue, c'est surtout dans la compréhension de la mise en pratique de ces principes et comment ça peut avoir des impacts disproportionnés sur certains acteurs dans la communauté. Donc, cet angle critique, je crois que c'est un rôle fondamental pour les chercheurs et chercheuses, c'est de prendre nos outils diversifiés, interdisciplinaires différents, de comprendre comment la mise en pratique dans un contexte particulier, pour les groupes en particulier, ont des conséquences disproportionnées, même si on commence d'une idée d'égalité, de liberté de chacun et chacune. Et donc, je crois, en sciences politiques, on est particulièrement outillé avec certaines approches pour faire ça en pratique, de voir comment les gens vont réagir en soutenant un principe qui est en pratique et très discriminatoire.
Well, a wonderful question, and who bears the political burdens of the conceptual uncertainty? Right? Well, wonderful. Yeah. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and so open to those in the room. Russ will help with any questions online. I think.
There's a hand raised online.
Great.
I can ask the questions.
Great. Great.
Yeah. Dans quelle mesure la dignité humaine peut-elle être un concept porteur pour recadrer la définition de la laïcité? Which is from Zinabzia. Do you want me to repeat?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Dans quelle mesure la dignité humaine peut-elle être un concept porteur pour recadrer la définition de la laïcité? C'est un peu général.
Yeah. Anyone who wants to answer? I thought perhaps David, you might want to begin, but I'm open to anyone. Why don't you? Yes.
So in psychology work on dehumanization, I think that might be une porte d'entrée dans la discussion, because I think sometimes when we think about human dignity coming as something from the sacred, but a lot of what we see in this sort of valorization of science is a shift towards humanism and humanist societies that are very much associated with secularism. And so, absolument, je pense que c'est une porte d'entrée qu'on va valoriser l'être humain, pas en tant que quelqu'un qui vient du sacré, mais vraiment quelqu'un qui en soi ont des valeurs, des droits humains, et c'est le ici qui est le plus important, c'est le fait qu'on est des êtres humains qui ont des expériences humaines. C'est ça qui donne des droits et des libertés plutôt que notre lien avec un Dieu quelconque.
Good answer. Do you want to?
Oui, le concept de dignité de la personne humaine s'inscrit aussi dans une laïcisation du droit, et notamment du droit comme on le voit au Canada, parce que effectivement on parlait avant du caractère sacré de la personne humaine. Donc ce sont des expressions qu'on pouvait retrouver dans certains domaines du droit, et notamment dans le droit criminel, et on va avoir une laïcisation progressive du droit. On va parler de la dignité plutôt que du caractère sacré de la personne humaine. Donc le concept de dignité fait partie prenante, il est au cœur aussi, je pense, de ce processus de laïcisation. Mais le concept de dignité peut lui-même aussi être mobilisé pour limiter certains droits et libertés. Donc, je pense que c'est un peu ce à quoi tu référais, Alison, et puis notamment la liberté de personnes dont certaines attitudes ne sont pas normalisées dans des représentations acceptables pour la majorité.
Thank you. Great question. Good follow-up. Any questions in the room, Frank?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I appreciate it. I want to hover over, let's call it the reconciliatory project, which has amongst other concerns that of what happens in primary and secondary schools, ostensibly secular institutions, right? And I don't doubt that this is different from region to region across the territories. A colleague of mine, called Ivan, features in the media, and when the reconciliatory project began, whenever that was, I would suggest it was 2015 when the report was, it predates that way, that schools were already aware of the importance of responding to the needs of Indigenous peoples and attempted to be responsive, but without any internal sort of knowledge about how to approach that. So what did they do? They did what they ought to do, and they contacted Indigenous peoples and communities to invite them to have discussions about how to affect their work. And if anybody, especially social scientists, are doing work in and through social work or through schools, you could ask all sorts of different questions to community members about phenomenon X. But for me, it always comes to the spiritual, let's call it, dimensions of whatever it is you're speaking about, and that's frequent. It's almost unavoidable, which is a good thing, I think. That's happened for schools, and Nigan was called to defend one school's approach in the media of doing something called the smudge. You've heard of the ceremony with medicines, and sometimes it's an abalone bowl. I'm just saying that in case anybody doesn't know what that is. And the declaration from some was that was a religious exercise. Mm-hmm. So the point of his dialogue in public was to attempt to present that practice as non-religious. I never bought into that myself, if I'm honest, and that's a different discussion. But the way schools have done this, though, is inviting people to engage in practices and speaking about things in these ostensibly secular institutions that I don't see as much of on the Christian side, right? So maybe we have to sort of confront what we mean by religion. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, does Canadian secularism as a tradition, as an ideal, as a political project, as it was described earlier, offer challenges to this aspect of the reconciliatory journey and such? And I understand that the devil's in the details about what constitutes a religion, what constitutes a spiritual practice. So, yeah.
I think that's an excellent question that gets right at the heart of the challenge of what reconciliation, if we'll just use that word for now, but as that actually expects, if we're going to just even think about the Royal Society or Canadian universities, actually expects these institutions to change. Like, it's not just that you're being inclusive, but you actually might need to change in certain ways. So even just to take the smudging, for example, as to build on that, at my university, University of Toronto, there's been a lot of conversation about this over the years. And finally, instead of trying to figure out all kinds of, different exhaust systems and all sorts of other things that were getting in the way of people being able to smudge, it is now just been accepted that you can put up a sign and people can smudge and people will know that there's going to be smoke in the area. But I think one of the critical things for getting to that point was helping people in the university understand that, yes, this is a spiritual practice, but it's also a sovereign practice in a different sort of way. And so trying to, it's not clear to me how this is all going to work out, but if we're actually going to live up to the calls to action in various kinds of ways in universities and elsewhere in broader Canadian society, we actually are going to need to grapple with, well, what does Indigenous ceremony or Indigenous spirituality mean for the way we do things in public? And I don't think we're there yet, but I think it's an utterly key question, and it's going to be really important and interesting to see how it gets worked out in different places at different times. And that's not necessarily an answer, but it's...
I understand.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add something, and then I know Audrey has probably our last question for our time. And so there's a decision on this issue, Frank, from British Columbia, from Port Alberni. It's a case called Servatius. It was a few years ago, 3 years ago, the supported appeal. It was very similar. There were both smudges and a hoop dance with a prayer at the school, and it was challenged by the Christian family the public school, saying that this offended the doctrine of state neutrality because you had a public school and a religious performance, either the smudge as a ceremony or the spoken prayer. And you've put, I think, your finger on it, which is that, there's a couple of ways that you can defend that assertion. One is to say it's not religious or spiritual. And so the category of culture is often employed to try and recharacterize what are understood from inside as religious or spiritual practices as not really religious. And it sounds like that was one strategy. And this gets to a point that Pamela made earlier, which is, I think, just really important as well. The other is to say, well, it is religious or it is spiritual, but it's also political and it's also historical and it's also taking place in a particular moment in a country's history and development. And therefore, it's right, whatever it is, for it to take place. And I think what's happening there is one version of what Pamela described and the playing out of the ways in which a kind of easy assertion of secularism can just embed what's come before. It just freezes what came before. And Pamela spoke about that in terms of Christianity and the move to secularism, kind of also prioritizing Christianity. Here, the risk of neutrality is that it comes at a particular moment. And you don't have to wrestle with the history anymore. You just declare that suddenly we're neutral. And I think that it's that sort of risk that is resisted in these kinds of cases by the historical and the political and the conceptual work that we saw here today, is thinking about, well, really what's happening in this moment. And so it's a very interesting case. It's very kind of present as a set of issues. And I think you're quite right, Frank, to have pointed to that as a really challenging space for thinking about what Canadian secularism might have as special contours around it.
Ever so quickly, there was mention about the academic areas of endeavor on this topic. And just ever so quickly, I was suddenly pressured to remove the word religion from a paper that just got published back in 2024, and just keep it within the spiritual realm. It wasn't deliberate, but it was, it was there.
Well, that whole question of the relationship to religion, spirituality, in particular in Indigenous spaces, is very complex and interesting as well. And so final question to Audrey.
So thank you so much. That was really a super rich and informative conversation. And what really strikes me is that this concept of secularism, which was really born in liberalism, universalism, humanisms, is now being used and even weaponized by different groups and used in different contexts and bent to mean different things. And it really, I think, bears a lot of resemblance with some of the concepts that we discussed actually yesterday from the keynote. Frank Deere, who discussed the notion of inclusivity and EDI, and where we see in a way that is very similar to a way that concepts that are difficult to be against, like to be diverse, to be inclusive, are being weaponized by taking examples out of context, by using. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit, and maybe this is something towards Alison's expertise, about these mechanisms in public opinion, in which concepts that are grand ideas, where concepts that have really borne a lot of good things for us, for society, including the fact that we've many women here in this room. Feminism is another concept for which this has happened. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these mechanisms in public opinion of bending concepts to mean other things.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a fantastic question. And I've done some work on EDI and various questions and how they're framed by political parties. And I think what you see often done is at the meeting, exactly like David had said in the case of what laicity means in this particular context, with a very ambitious named bill with a very specific focus, is that through political rhetoric, you can tie DEI to woke. And what does woke mean? Who the heck knows? But it has this very particular defined meaning in that context, because there has been a political discourse that translates something that's very lofty, diversity, equity, and inclusion, into something that becomes a soundbite, and politicians and various political actors and social movements, I mean, this is what we're trying to do, is get very complex things understood very easily by the public. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the main mechanism, is that you have this association and you simplify it to apply to a very particular context, and a very particular context that is threatening. And so when DEI gets brought up and equated with woke, and then equated with very particular groups, that you can see these mechanisms of threat and simplification come together, and people react quickly, and they think things are changing too quickly, and so they react to its application in particular contexts that are cases where if you sat down and talked with somebody, you might get a lot more nuance. But in that sort of step-by-step process of where you activate, frame, simplify, and then apply it to a group that's viewed as other, like you see this process come out in what's going on, sometimes effectively, sometimes people aren't effective at doing this. But I think in those sorts of conversations, we often see that being the case. So the fact that laicity means something very specific to your average Quebecer, and it wouldn't outside of Quebec necessarily. For if you ask somebody in a public opinion survey, I would never use the word secularism if I was asking them a local public opinion question. I would absolutely in Quebec, because it has a meaning, because it's become salient in a public discourse for particular strategic reasons. And you can be for or against the reasons, the principles. I think that's what I was trying to say, that the principles are defended, but sometimes its application has other motives.
Well, I want to thank David and Pamela and Allison, and also to everyone who attended online and in the room for a wonderful conversation. I think maybe the fruits of which will keep unfolding. For those attending online, I just want to kind of urge you to keep your eye on the Royal Society of Canada feed for other events, in particular events at the college that have things rolling out all the time. And to thank again our panel and all of you in attendance. And so I hope you join me in offering that gratitude to this group of 3 scholars.